presentations were supposed to come next, but they're going to be presentations numbers 4 and 5. The next person up will be Mr. Mohammed Alafranji. I hope I pronounced the name right. I do apologize if I don't. And Mohammed is a manager at Asset Agritech Accelerator in Jordan. And it's basically a private equity company that helps to kickstart investments in Jordan, and particularly with focus on technology and innovation in the agri-tech sector. And Mohammed has more than 20 years of experience in marketing and entrepreneurship, and we're looking forward to hearing more from Mohammed soon. Then afterwards, we'll hear from Mr. Yusuf Hamidadin. Again, apologies if I don't say the name correctly, who will be presenting for the Wadi Arba Agritech Fund, which is a relatively recent fund that has been put together in Jordan, and is again promoting the investments into the Jordanian fertilizer, or rather into the agriculture industries, particularly with the focus on the Wadi. Yusuf has held various chairmanships before and CEO positions in other companies, and has a background in economics and quantitative methods. And then finally, the gentleman from Proton, which is nice to see, father and daughter on the stage later on. We have the CEO of Proton Ventures, Mr. Hans Reinhoff, and he'll present a bird's eye view on technology that complies with our sustainability goals that we have, particularly with regards also to energy storage. Hans has a lot of experience. He's been in the energy storage and ammonia storage market since 1982, so just before I was born, so quite a lot of time. And he has held various leading positions in the industry for a while. And then last but definitely not least, and I do apologize if the lady goes last, but Rianne Reinhoff is presenting on the history of green ammonia, and particularly with reference to the ammonia history in the US, Australia, and Europe. And she holds a Bachelor of Commerce and has had various positions in marketing communications before joining Proton Ventures in 2016. And that's the lineup, and I hope you'll enjoy the presentation. I'm going to go now present on my paper, which is the first one up. I'm not sure if the slides are ready or not yet, but yeah. Okay, so regional unpredictability is the topic that I want to, there's a clicker or something? Is that here? Ah, perfect, thank you very much. So there's some contact details if you wish to get in contact. I think we can skip the introduction of next, and I've already had talked about this a little bit. Like I said, we do project finance and M&A transaction support, technology benchmarking, and these sort of things. So if you have any questions about this, please do get in touch with me a little later. So the agenda for today is rather short. So we have an introduction and an introduction also into the market mechanisms and methodologies. Then we talk about the regional uncertainties and unpredictabilities that are in the market currently, and I will come to some conclusions. Now, starting with the introduction to market mechanisms, but perhaps before we start, this is a bit of a strange presentation because I'm going to jump back and forth a little bit between certain topics, and it can be viewed a little bit as a contribute or a tribute to the consulting profession, if you and hopefully we'll see what I mean in a minute. So, but starting with the MENA region. So the MENA region is of course a large exporter of commodity fertilizer products. So particularly ammonia, urea, and phosphate products, and commodities are characterized by and large by a lack of variation in the product specifications. So pretty standardized products. And the reason why there is a lot of investments here in this particular region is because, generally for investment decisions to take place, you'll have, there's a certain factors that you have to keep in mind, but the three main ones perhaps are availability and cost of raw materials, the proximity to end-use markets, and capital requirements and availability. And if you have one of these, and ideally all three of them, then you have a relatively good chance of getting your project financed and the project construction underway. And of course, in the MENA region, the biggest advantage is, of course, the access to raw materials, and to some degree also the closest to certain export markets. The capital requirements, or let's say in a lot of places, the capital requirements are also reasonable because the infrastructure is in place and we have already a relatively mature industry already, depending on where in the region, but and there's obviously capital availability as well. So looking at the global map, there is, while it can change from country to country, in general you can speak of different import and export markets, and the MENA region is definitely an export market with most other and a few other export markets as well, like the north of South America, so Venezuela and Trinidad. You have China, this is regards to ammonia and urea, of course. Then Eastern Europe and China as exporters of all the rest as regions, as far as regions concerns, are mainly importing regions. But I want to park this a little bit for now and look at methodologies. We'll get back to, we'll get back to the situation and how the MENA region fits into this equation. And so prices in general can be viewed as a mechanism of, or can be divided into the cost plus margin. So you have cost of production, and you have a price that you're selling your product for, and everything in between is margin. So any price can be distinguished between these two elements. And the cost side is really by and large driven by feedstock costs. Whereas on the margin side, the margin really is a combination of market dynamics. So we look at the supply and demand balance and see what, how this balance develops, and that sort of depends or gives an indicator of how the margins develops going forward. Now the cost side is important, particularly at the high end of the cost curve. So at the high end of the cost curve, we look at what we're calling the laggard regions. So the laggard region is what we call a representative or an archetype plant that represents the upper quartile of the cost curve. And these are very important for what we call trough periods. So if you have high supply compared to demand, and prices are suppressed, then these laggard regions, or the cost of production of these laggard regions, are really the ones that set what we call the floor price, under which the price of the materials are not going to, or the cost of the price of the products are not going down for a sustained period of time. Because if that was to happen, then of course the plants would close and the prices would go up again. Now on the top side of the cycle, this is where now the MENA region comes back in. This is where this is really determined by the level of investments, and basically, if when prices have been down for some sustained period of time and investments have slowed down, ultimately what we're seeing is the demand ultimately picks up again and pushes prices up. Once prices going up, and particularly at the lower end of the cost curve, people make a lot of money, then the investment starts to happen. And thus you end up with what we call a cyclicality. And of course, I know that there's debate about whether there is actually cyclicality in the market or if this concept has been lost. But the fact of the matter is that we are in the industry, and it is usually the case that if the prices are more exciting and the companies do better, that we get more inquiries for feasibility studies, and in trough periods we get more typically inquiries for M&A transaction support. I think we could skip this slide. This is just showing how the cost of production is built up, but the main message here is really that it's raw material cost driven. But the next slide is quite important because that shows you how prices and the price models and the market models really link in together and are rigorous. We have the dotted line here is what we call the operating rate. And the operating rate is really the capacity, global capacity divided by production. And that gives us a very good indicator of how long or short the market is. And that is obviously understandable. So you have the capacity, and if production goes up and capacity stays similar, then of course the operating rates goes up, and we see the market is a sign that the market sees a lot of demand relative to supply demand, relative to capacity development. And so there is an inherent link between how the operating rate of the global operating rate performs and how the margins perform in various different regions. And particularly what we do typically is we look at the various different margins and various different return on investment developments in different regions. And for us, it is still the Western European producers that are a good representative of the upper quartile. That doesn't mean they're the highest cost producers. Doesn't mean that they're the ultimate price setter for in every single point in time, but it's a good representative. And the interesting thing about it is if you look at the margin development, you'll see that the margins in trough periods hit exactly zero. And it can also go negative, but usually not for a very long time before prices shoot up again because plants are mothballing or being closed or whatever. So, but this is sort of the idea behind it. So you have the market approach and you have the pricing approach, and they're interlinked by what we call the operating rate. Which brings us to the meaty bit of the presentation, so the regional uncertainties. So in order to understand how prices develop, we need to understand how markets develop. And on the global level, I'm going to be careful of what I'm saying next, but on the global level, it's reasonably easy to predict how demand is going to grow for fertilizers. And the reason why I'm saying that is because ultimately it is correlated to population growth. Meaning if there's a new baby in the world, it needs to eat. And if it eats, then the nutrients need to be replenished to the soil. And this is as simple as it gets. So of course at the moment there is talk about, and we've heard in previous presentations discuss this as well, that there is talk about the fact that there is over-application in certain regions and the yield curves might not be optimal and these sort of things. But even if everything was optimal, we would still need, with the growing population, we need to feed more mouths. And as simple as that, that's why ultimately we will need to have more fertilizers. And even if you have problems, for example, in agriculture, environmentally driven problems, in, I don't know, in China or so, and then you have lower food production there, then this will have to be compensated elsewhere. But on the production side, it's perhaps a bit more tricky, because where will the production come from? And how much capacity will be built and at what times? And so we have to ask ourselves, so what's the firm capacity, what's the speculative capacity? So firm capacity is what we call, or what we look at, how we look at plants that have already been financed and or construction has already commenced. And this firm capacity is, again, with one exception, relatively straightforward. I mean, there's a lot of plants that have been financed and construction started, but ultimately is never going to be finished. But these are by and large exceptions. And so if you know that a plant has been, the construction has commenced, ultimately you will end up knowing that in 4 years or in 5 years or whatever the construction plan is, you'll have the plant coming into the market. On the speculative side, this is a bit more tricky, because on the speculative side, this is so basically past the next 4 or 5 years, where we don't know exactly where and what's going to happen and how much capacity will develop and so forth. And so the situations can differ on a regional basis, and even firm capacity, and that's unfortunately the point. There's actually two problems there. The first one is that the Chinese capacity, there's a bit of a question mark on how the Chinese capacity is going to develop in terms of plant closures, of course, which is a bit of a black box. And the other problem is that you have regional differences in how the economic situations are and so forth, which mean that a couple of years ago you wouldn't have expected that certain things developed, and suddenly the investment situation in a country can completely change. And this is exactly what we're going to talk about now. So I know this has been already touched upon in the previous presentations, but in the US, for example, We have seen, well, it's good to remind everyone that in the US in the early 2000s, we've had higher natural gas costs than in Western Europe, which is very difficult to believe, but it is actually the case. And in the US, it was actually a technological breakthrough that suddenly changed everything. It was also, there were other factors in place, of course. There were high energy prices at the time, so that this technology was actually enabled. But ultimately, it led to a huge capacity additions in the United States. And if you had asked anybody, let's say around 2000, I don't know, 2007 or so, before the breakthrough came, I don't think anybody would have predicted this. India is another interesting example, because in India, you had in the not too long ago a net import position of a bit more than 2 million tons per year, which morphed to more than 10 million tons in 2015. And there have been some, let's say, changes into the natural gas pricing system, as well as political support for developing capacity. And now we're seeing quite a significant amount of capacity being built in India, which will close the gap, again, the net import gap, again, to more historic levels. But again, this is a policy-driven change. In Australia, the most surprising thing is that nothing happened at all. Because in Australia, if you use common sense, we would argue, well, you know, in Australia you have a good natural resource base, you have coal, you have natural gas, but the situation is effectively that there is no production, or hardly any production, and Australia is a big importer of urea. So, but of course the Perdaman project is there, it has been there for many years, and if that actually materializes, then the net importing position of Australia will suddenly shrink quite significantly. Which brings us to Africa. I know that Halim before said there's only one Africa, but the reason why I like this picture is that it shows a clear divide between the north and the south in terms of agricultural production anyways. And of course, the north is rather arid, and the sub-Saharan climate is a lot more tropical. And most of the production is in the north, and the most of the, let's say, demand potential is south. But looking at Africa as a market, it's always an interesting one, because everybody, well, as long as I can remember, is always talking about Africa as the new big thing in terms of demand. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at Africa on a regional basis, you actually see that Africa is a huge net exporter already. And by and large, helped, of course, a lot by the recent additions in Nigeria and elsewhere. And so the question really is here, how is demand going to develop, and can we predict that Africa is going to be the destination of choice for production in other parts of the world? Which brings us to Egypt, which is perhaps one of the best examples currently for unpredictability, because as we all know, there were some changes politically and economically in Egypt, which ultimately led to a situation where the production levels have declined quite considerably. But a couple of years later, production is up again, and the interest in investments is enormous. So if you had asked us 4 or 5 years ago what the outcome is going to be like, and what the investment situation in Egypt is going to look like in a couple of years' time, it would have been very difficult to answer that question. Which brings us again to Africa as a whole. So the demand in Africa is there, or the potential for demand is there. But there is also in sub-Saharan Africa a lot of demand or a lot of interest in developing capacity. So the capacity that the green countries here are illustrating the countries where there is currently interest, and the red dots are the ones that show where there's already capacity in place and where there's additional interest in developing more of it. And these are not the only places, of course, where there is unpredictability in the market. So you have, of course, already talked about China extensively in the last session, and There's a concern about how many plant closures there are going to be. Are they going to be replaced by even larger plants? So if 10, 15,000 tons per year plants are going to close, are they going to be replaced by one with over 1 million tons? Venezuela, of course, with a significant amount of natural resources and geographically well placed to supply the north and the south of the Americas, is facing currently some political and economic challenges, and production levels and investment levels are at historic lows. Iran is obviously always an interesting topic, because Iran naturally has a lot of natural gas and a potential to supply the Asian markets and so forth. But are there sanctions? Are there no sanctions? How long are they going to take? You know, of course, with these sanctions, there's a lack of access to markets, to technology and financing. But how long is it going to take? When are we expecting these capacity to come on? Is it going to be next year? Is it going to be in 5 years? Who knows? And then ultimately Brazil, as a big import market, you would expect that plants and reasonable resources as well, and natural resources, that is, you would expect that plants would not close in Brazil, but the fact of the matter is they did. And this is partly a result of political and that's partly also natural gas supply driven. And ultimately Russia and Eastern Europe. So of course there is a lot of natural gas there, and of course being a big region with limited access to open water sources in some cases, it always has the issue of overland freight. But by and large, how is the situation going to develop there? Ukraine, who was going to predict that this is going to happen in the region, and how long is it going to last? So these are so basically with the conclusions. So just to recap, we've said that prices consist of cost plus margin. Costs are by and large driven by raw material costs, which the costs are relatively easy to understand. So we know the technology, we know how much raw materials are being consumed in the different production processes. We can have an assumption on different oil price scenarios and natural gas pricing situations. But the margin is a bit more difficult because the margin is inherently linked to market developments, and the market developments, particularly the operating rate, is the one that ultimately illustrates how tight or long a market is. And while on the demand side globally, you could say, okay, well, you know, if there's more population going forward, in the long run, we'll have to need more fertilizers. Does it grow by 1.4%, 1.5%? But ultimately, the difference is not that dramatic. On the supply side, however, this is a lot more challenging, because on the supply side, we have all these different influences that are unpredictable in nature, and where we could say, well, how long is this trough that we're currently facing going to last? And I mean, one conclusion, of course, is that the MENA region will, as it is, you know, has access to raw materials, will always be a global export hub. Unfortunately, however, and I want to close with this statement, which is not the best statement to close with, but unfortunately, it seems that while we're in this trough currently, unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be much upside potential, because most of the uncertainties that we're seeing in the market are actually, let's say, potential for additional capacity to come in stream, which would actually lengthen the trough that we are currently facing. And with this rather unfortunate remark, I'd like to close. And I don't know if we have Q&A. I think we have maybe one or two questions, if you so wish.
I did not really get the last part of the trough and how it's related to what you were saying about the capacity.
Sorry, again?
So the last statement that you said, it's unfortunate, about the trough and how it will affect on the market price and all of this. I did not really understand this.
I see.
Can you explain it more?
I see. Yeah, so basically what we're trying to say is that at the global, if you look at a cost curve, so you model all the different capacities around the world and rank them by their production economics. It's the top end that really determines the floor prices. So that side is reasonably clear. Of course, it's never that easy, but it's reasonably clear. The problem is on how much margin do we put on top of this low cost on this cost of production to determine how market prices are going to develop. And this margin is determined by how long or short a market is. So if there's a lot of demand compared to supply, then the margins trend up, and ultimately prices as well. And the other way around. But the low end of in the trough period, you won't come further down than this cost of production, because otherwise the plants close and the prices go up. There are of course long-term changes, so the dynamics of the cost curve can change. If new low-cost producers push in and push everything out, then structurally the lower end of the cost curve can come down again. But generally speaking, the trough at the moment that we're seeing, so that the lower end of the prices, is because there is quite a lot of supply in the market. And unfortunately, there is so much unpredictability in the market, but most of it seems to be that if the status quo changes, that there might be even more capacity, which would prolong that trough. It doesn't, yeah? Thank you. Okay, I think if there's no other question, then thank you very much.